Okay, we are going to finish up this semester looking at Reconstruction. Specifically, we are going to look at the closing act of Reconstruction. How, despite its good intentions, Reconstruction can be viewed, and probably should be viewed, as a failure. Alright, so we'll start off here with the election of 1868. By this point, congressional Reconstruction is already going on, but we do need to point out who the president is going to be, even though Congress is kind of going to be running Reconstruction now. Okay? The Republicans nominate Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero, the guy that had beaten Lee, the guy that the Union kind of said he was the winning general. They're taking a page out of the Whig playbook. Again, they're going to campaign by waving the bloody shirt. Vote Republican. Don't vote Democrat. Democrats are the ones who started the Civil War and caused the need for all this Reconstruction. They're also going to campaign by supporting radical Reconstruction. Grant himself may not have, but Congress is the ones that are going to be in charge, and Grant is going to go along with what Congress wants. The Democrats are going to instead nominate a guy named Horatio Seymour. He and the Democrats campaign by attacking Reconstruction, and here in this cartoon, you can see exactly where the Republicans believe that's going. We have our guy here in 1868 supporting Seymour and Blair, but if you look over here in 1864, that hat has the abbreviation CSA on it. Of course, in 1868, it's got the abbreviation KKK on it. But this is what the Republicans are saying. And you notice, "'Tis but a change of banners." This is what the Democrats stand for, according to the Republicans. Of course, Grant is going to win. Grant, by the way, is reelected in 1862. We'll talk more about him and his administration when we get to something called the Gilded Age next semester. But it's important to know that one of the goals of the Republicans had been to get the freedmen, the former slaves in the South, to vote Republican. And overall, Grant wins the popular vote. He only wins the popular vote by about 300,000. Well, 500,000 of the people who voted in that election were freedmen who overwhelmingly voted Republican. Now, we've talked earlier about the positives that Reconstruction brought about. We haven't talked about, how did Southerners view those Reconstruction efforts. Southerners are very hostile to Reconstruction. Okay? They viewed it as the victorious North taking advantage of the South, rubbing salt in the wound, being sore winners, you might say. And so the South comes up with all these creative names for people that they don't like, who support Reconstruction. First, we have what are called carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who came to the South, and Southerners said that they were here to take advantage of what was going on. Business owners, people that are trying to install factories. Why are they here? Well, because the South is so economically broken that we will be willing to work for anything. And so they know that they can pay Southerners less than they could pay workers up in the North. And while that is true, the Southerners would have still been making more in the factory than they would have been making on the farm. So this still would have been an economic benefit, but the South doesn't see it like that. They see it as someone taking advantage. And so there's this caricature of the Northern carpetbaggers who are coming down here. They're greedy. They're seeking to take advantage of us. We also have another term called scalawags. Scalawags were Southerners who supported Reconstruction, and they supported Reconstruction for various reasons. Some of them were Southerners who had never believed in the Confederacy. They believed in the Union, and during the war they had been persecuted. They'd had their property taken. They had been thrown into prison, and now they are out for revenge. Scalawags also included poor farmers who saw Reconstruction as a chance to change the economic, social, and maybe even the political structure of the South. And when the Republicans came in and said, that's what we want to do, these poor white farmers a lot of times were on their side. This was a good thing to them. It also included Southern businessmen who kind of looked at the situation in the Civil War and what led to the South's failure, the economy, and saying, look, basing it all on agriculture was a mistake. We need to diversify it. We need to grow the Southern economy. So these were all people who had good reasons to support Reconstruction, but they will be attacked by their own people. They will be attacked by other Southerners. Now, the freedmen in the South, what's going on with them while Reconstruction is going along? The freedmen exercised their rights when it was protected by federal troops. As long as the federal troops are there, the freedmen very quickly started trying to exercise their rights and take advantage of those rights. There are these things that Congress passed and the states ratified called the Civil War Amendments. You have to know the Civil War Amendments. The 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery in the United States. Okay. This is where the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, this is where they were required to end slavery because now we have a federal amendment banning it. The 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment does several things. For our purposes here regarding Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment granted the former slaves citizenship and said that no citizen could have their rights taken away. And then the 15th Amendment, the last of the Civil War amendments, gave all men the right to vote regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. African Americans, when they were able to vote, they elected other African Americans to positions within government. Several African Americans were elected as lieutenant governors. Several were elected to state legislatures. You had one state legislature, I believe it was South Carolina, where a majority of one of the legislatures that met during Reconstruction was made up of African Americans. No other state had a majority at any time of African Americans in the state legislature, but they were there and they did make important contributions. Hiram R. Revels, if you look over here at this picture, he is the gentleman over here on the left. Hiram Rhodes Revels, he is the first African American elected to the Senate. Ironically, he comes from the state of Mississippi. Now, the sad part about African American participation and African American ability to exercise their rights, as Reconstruction ended and the federal troops left, that protection when it left, African Americans were intimidated and prevented from exercising those rights after that. Now, another huge part of the freedmen community was the church. The church became the center of that community, and so the two denominations that grew the most from African American participation were the Methodists and the Baptists. But the church, it wasn't just the church. The church was the center of African American society, freedmen society, and it was also the center of freedmen political leadership. At one point, a African American pastor said that as a pastor, it was his duty, not only to God, but to his congregation, to lead them in political activity. The churches didn't just lead the social and political aspects of it, they also helped promote literacy and education. And so here we have a young woman, okay, she's also a carpetbagger, by the way, teaching the entire church, the entire congregation here, how to read. So the church had set up a school within its walls. Now, economically, the freedmen just are not going to do well. Most freedmen became sharecroppers. Okay? You're taking a huge number of people who have very little other skills other than working on the farm. And so needing money, you're going to have to use what you have. And a lot of them ended up being sharecroppers. Sharecroppers are people who worked on the farm. A lot of times the seed, the tools was provided by the landowner. The landowner might also provide you with shelter. He might provide you with clothing. There's a contract where the landowner says, I'm going to provide all of this material. You'll work the land, and at the end of the year, at the end of the season, when everything is planted, you will receive a share of the crop that you as the sharecropper would then turn around and sell, and you'd use that money to live on for the next year. The problem with this activity is a lot of times the owner, the landowner would say, all right, here is your share of the crop. Now, let us talk about what you owe me. I provided you tools. When you returned them, I am going to have to get them sharpened. They were dull. I'm going to have to take back part of your share. During the year, I may have loaned you money. I'm going to have to take back part of your share for payment now. And they would find a way to take and take and take so that the share you received was enough to get by. It was never enough to get ahead. Other freedmen who maybe didn't want to sharecrop were still forced into taking low-wage, low-skill positions. Okay? They were cooks. This is a picture of women by the river doing laundry. So they were cooks. They were laundresses. They were doing menial tasks for very low pay. And that's something that continued into the 20th century, and you can argue we continue to see the effects of that even now. Now, despite all the positives that we talked about earlier that Reconstruction provided, the South is going to resist Reconstruction. Okay? Part of the reason the South resisted Reconstruction wasn't just the idea of being sore losers. Part of it wasn't just the fact that they wanted to their own political control. Part of it was definitely white supremacy. And several different groups formed promoting white supremacy. The most infamous, the one that we know, is the KKK. And when they originally formed, they didn't wear the white hoods that have become so familiar in our collective consciousness. They wore whatever. The mystique, I guess, around the KKK was that they were the ghosts of the dead Confederate soldiers. Their first leader was a guy named Nathan Bedford Forrest. We've seen his name before. He was a general for the South during the Civil War. The main goals of not only the KKK, but any of these other groups was to keep blacks from exercising their rights. The most important right to take away from someone is the right to vote. If they cannot make decisions, then they have to accept kind of whatever is being done to them politically. So they wanted to keep African Americans from exercising their rights, particularly the right to vote. The second goal was to drive the Republicans out. Get rid of Republicans. And finally, if they can do these two things, they would be able to end Reconstruction. And so that's their goal. And of course, being the KKK, we kind of know what they do. Okay? They engage in terrorism. This is not lost on the North. And the North knows what's going on. Reports come in from the South of what is going on. And so here we have another Thomas Nast political cartoon showing here's another group, the White League. Okay? Hand in hand with the Ku Klux. Okay? They're fighting for the Union as it was. Notice here, this is actually a John C. Calhoun quote. This is a white man's government. They're fighting for what the South is starting to call the lost cause. You might still hear that phrase today when somebody says, well, the South, was fighting for states' rights. It really was the lost cause. Well, no, the South was fighting for slavery. Okay? But what is the goal that these two groups have? Their goal is to make conditions for African Americans in the South worse than slavery. And we can see some of the things that they do. Lynchings, the schoolhouse in flames, and even the little kid who's been beaten and killed. Over here, this is a little bit more real, I guess. This has to do with, this is a political cartoon that Thomas Nast drew after a race riot in South Carolina. Okay? One white man had been killed, and as a result, 6 African Americans were lynched in cold blood. And here, Lady Justice, who has taken off her veil because she's no longer blind to what's going on. Lady Justice is pointing to the imbalance in the scales. And down here at the bottom, it says, Declaration of Equality. 5 more wanted. Okay. Justice demands equality. In Thomas Nast's eyes, equality not only before the law, but equality also in punishment. So we have these guys who are pursuing extra-legal methods of trying to end Reconstruction, but then we also have a group called the Redeemers. The Redeemers are going to be the politicians, the Southern Democrats who are out to save the South from what they view as the evils of Reconstruction. They're here to redeem the South. And so, as Reconstruction ends, these guys start to get reelected. They may not be the actual Southern Democrats who started the Civil War. But remember, some of those guys got pardons from Andrew Johnson and were able to come back into power. This may be their children, the next generation, who were raised to believe some of the same things they believed. Okay? But as they come into power, they start undoing a lot of the Reconstruction reforms. And one of the ways they were able to gain that political power was by doing something called drawing the color line. When they ran for office, they appealed to that white supremacy nature and promised that one of the things they would do once they gained power was to institute policies that would eventually lead to segregation. And they would make sure that the white race was superior. They also called for what has been termed a new South. They said that there needed to be a new South. There was the South as it was, but there was a need for a new South. And the new South was going to look a little bit different. It was going to be economically diverse. It was going to have industry. It wasn't just going to be based on cotton and agriculture. It was going to have industry. It was going to be more diverse. They recognized that one of the weaknesses in the Civil War was the poor economy. But they also said that the New South was going to be controlled by whites. Again, appealing to that segregation, that white supremacy attitude. And the third thing they wanted to make up the New South was one-party political rule. And it was going to be ruled by Democrats, not by Republicans. Okay? So this New South was going to be very similar to what existed before the Civil War. Now, as the South is trying to fight Reconstruction and dragging Reconstruction out and making it last longer and longer, and the North is starting to lose interest, the Supreme Court also starts to undo some of the Reconstruction reforms and efforts. Okay? Gradually, the Supreme Court is going to rule against some of the things that the North was trying to do. In one case called the Slaughterhouse Cases, the slaughterhouse cases didn't even really have to do with racial issues. It had to deal literally with slaughterhouses. The slaughterhouses in the city of New Orleans were forced by the state of Louisiana to move south of New Orleans to prevent public health hazards. They sued under the idea that their rights under the 14th Amendment had been violated by the state government. And the Supreme Court ruled in this case that the 14th Amendment protected individuals from actions of the national government, not actions of the states. And at first, when you look at this case and you kind of look at what I laid out, well, what does a slaughterhouse have to do with segregation and the end of Reconstruction? Well, if the 14th Amendment only protects citizens from actions of the federal government, then what protects you from actions of the states? And so the Southern states start listening to these things and saying, wait a minute. If we can do whatever we want, this is the road to Jim Crow. Okay. Another court case, U.S. versus Cruikshank. U.S. versus Cruikshank said specifically the protection of civil rights was up to the individual states. It's a state issue, not the federal government. This invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1866, okay? Where it says, if this federal government doesn't protect your civil rights, if you feel your civil rights have been violated, you don't sue in federal court. You sue in state court, according to U.S. versus Cruikshank. Finally, U.S. versus Reese, 1876, the 15th Amendment does not fully protect the right to vote under all circumstances. States can place restrictions on who can vote. Now, specifically, the Supreme Court did say, look, the 15th Amendment says you cannot deny the vote based on race. But the states can place other restrictions. For example, literacy tests. Can a person read before they can vote? And so each of these cases is going to weaken one of the North's goals for Reconstruction, and that was to protect the rights of African Americans. By 1876, Reconstruction is close to the end. And we have an election. The two candidates for office, the Republicans nominate this guy, Rutherford B. Hayes, another war hero. The Democrats nominated a guy named Samuel Tilden. Okay. At the end of the day, at the end of the election, Tilden won 184 electoral votes. Hayes won 165. But there are still 20 electoral votes outstanding. So there's 20 electoral votes that are disputed in this election. So this is at the first count, Tilden has 184, Hayes has 165, and a disputed electoral vote count is 20. And so this is what the map looks like on election night. Okay? The green states down here in the south, obviously, voting for Tilden. The red states voting for Hayes. And then these yellow areas, the disputed electoral votes. This one over here in Oregon is one vote that was disputed. The other two were not disputed. This one was. That one we don't care about. That one everybody agreed. There were so many problems that the Republican definitely won that one. So sometimes they say it's Hayes lost by 20. Sometimes they say by 19 because they go ahead and give that to him. But whatever. There were disputed results. Okay. These three down here, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, they were, in this election, still unreconstructed. But they have different sets of returns, and each side is arguing that the other side cheated. And so there's this question about, okay, what now? White Southerners in these states had intimidated black voters, and so Republicans were arguing that that part of the vote was illegal. To win the presidency, if you missed those numbers earlier, candidate needed 185 votes. So Samuel Tilden is one vote short of becoming president. Hayes has to run the table. He has to get all of those votes. And so Congress is left with this question of, okay, what are they going to do? We started this whole problem with a compromise, the 3/5 compromise. We'll end it with a compromise. Okay. What's going to happen in the election is Congress creates a commission, a committee that's going to receive evidence and look at the returns and decide which of the two candidates should receive the disputed electoral votes, Tilden or Hayes. The committee was made up of 15 people. Originally, It was 5 people from the Supreme Court, 5 from the House, and 5 from the Senate. And the original split, there were 7 committed Republicans, there were 7 committed Democrats, and 1 person from the Supreme Court who swore he was neutral. He was then appointed by the state of Illinois to another position. He resigned from the Supreme Court and was replaced by another Supreme Court justice who was a Republican. And so the committee ends up being made up of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. And if you're not cynical about politics, this is going to make you, because the committee is going to vote in all cases 8-7 to give all the electoral votes to Hayes. Now, if you are a Democrat, this ticks you off. If you are Samuel Tilden, this really ticks you off. But there's a deal made. Compromise. The compromise is Democrats are going to accept the results. They're going to accept that Hayes is president. Southern Democrats are going to agree that they will protect and support black civil rights. Hayes, on the other hand, would only serve 1 term. This is going to be a 1-term presidency. He's not running for re-election. And his first official act as president is he will end Reconstruction and pull the last remaining federal troops out, turning control of the South back to those southern states and back to those southern Democrats. And so Reconstruction ends. And so we have to have a final assessment of Reconstruction. How well did the North and did the Republicans do at achieving those goals that we talked about earlier? Well, the first goal was to restore the Union and end any animosity between the states. By the end of Reconstruction, plenty of animosity remains. You have some Northerners who are looking at, you can still see the background picture of what's going on, and saying, did we really win? No, there's plenty of animosity. A lot of the southern states, they were required by the radical Congress to do certain things in their state constitutions and pass certain laws. And some of them drug their feet and didn't. They were required to ratify the 13th Amendment. Mississippi didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1995. Right? Tennessee didn't ratify the 15th Amendment until 1997. Okay? You're not misreading those numbers. Over 100 years after the Civil War. And we have 2 states that have not ratified those amendments. The states were required to renounce secession. We specifically had to say secession is wrong and illegal. Texas did not officially renounce secession in its state constitution. Okay? It doesn't specifically say Texas can secede. That's not in there either. But it also doesn't say we can't. And so there is still this ambiguous idea of, can Texas secede, yes or no? Did it reshape Southern society? Well, the goal was to remove the planter aristocracy from the top, grow the middle class, and integrate the freedmen into Southern society. Well, the redeemers, the people who took over Southern politics at the end of Reconstruction, were just the old Southern Democrats. They haven't gone anywhere. They may have been replaced by their children or their grandchildren, but they're still in power. And once segregation is allowed to take hold, African Americans in the South are second-class citizens. They were not given and not allowed to exercise the same rights as everyone else. They were at the bottom again. Was the South physically rebuilt? Not during Reconstruction. Okay? The national government hadn't funded the physical rebuilding. It was determined by the radicals in Congress that was part of the punishment. You are on your own to rebuild what the Union armies destroyed. At the same time, when there were Northerners, bankers and industrialists who were willing to come down to the South and provide economic gain for the South, the Southerners actually fought them and tried to reject them and tried to kick them out. So the capital that could have been there from that revenue source was denied and rejected. And finally, one of the goals was to establish the Republican Party in the South. Well, during Reconstruction, African Americans vote Republican. Just 95%. Once Reconstruction's over, you cannot find a Republican in the South. It was very difficult. African Americans are being terrorized and denied the right to vote and scared out of voting. And if they're going to vote Republican, you're not going to find it. That's not entirely true. There were Republicans in the South, but they're very difficult to find. They might win extremely local elections. Okay? The South, as it was after Reconstruction, became known as the Solid South. In presidential elections, in national elections for Senate and Congress, the South is going to vote Democrat for roughly 100 years. The South will vote Democrat. They were a section of the country that Democrats could write off. We don't have to campaign there because we know we're going to win, and Republicans would write off too. We don't have to campaign there. We know we're going to lose. And so ultimately the goals that they had for Reconstruction failed. That's the last video for the semester. I hope you got all those. I hope they made sense. Bring questions to class if you need them.